Hi, welcome to your Apple Update. I'm your host, John Sherrod, and boy, do we have a lot to talk about because today was the annual keynote kicking off Apple's Worldwide Developers Conference. This is also known as WWDC or sometimes DubDub, which just sounds gross to me, but the Worldwide Developers Conference is an annual conference where developers from all over the world who develop products for the Apple ecosystem come to San Jose, California to hear from Apple, to get in sessions all week long, to meet with thousands of Apple engineers so that they can get their questions answered directly and learn about all the new things, particularly new things coming to Apple's various software platforms: iOS, watchOS, tvOS, macOS, and now iPadOS, which we're definitely going to talk about here later on. And from those of us on the outside who don't get to go to WWDC, really the big focus is on the Monday morning keynote, and that's where Tim Cook and a variety of other Apple executives and vice presidents take the stage to talk about all the latest things happening in the world of Apple software in particular. So in the last several years in particular, this has mostly not been a hardware event. In other words, you're not going to see a new iPhone released at this event. But we did have one big hardware announcement, or two really, in the form of an all-new Mac Pro, which we're definitely going to talk about, and an all-new Apple Display for pros, which we're, again, absolutely going to talk about. So this is going to be kind of a lightning round recap. I want to talk about a lot of the things that interested me that they talked about today, and of course we're going to talk about those hardware products, and then throughout the week I want to have some additional videos diving a little deeper into things, and of course if any additional news comes out that we need to talk about, definitely going to do that here. So started out the event, Apple started out by talking about some of the services that it announced at its services event earlier this year, including Apple TV Plus. They still haven't given us any firm launch date or anything as far as pricing for this service, but today they did show the trailer for one of their shows, and this is funny. This show is called All Mankind, and it's the premise of the show is that think about the space race in the 1960s between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, but imagine the space race never ended, and that's the premise for the show. And it's done by Ronald D. Moore of Star Trek Deep Space Nine and Battlestar Galactica fame. So because he's done some really interesting projects in the past, and because I happen to be a space history junkie, this was a particular interest to me, and so it was really frustrating that we didn't get to see a preview of this back at the event earlier this year, where Apple had a lot of these creators come out and talk about their shows, but we did get the trailer today. I thought it looked fantastic. I can't wait to see this show. And that was kind of all we got from Apple services, at least specifically. And then Apple they kind of pivoted over into talking about the Apple TV as a whole. Not a ton of news there. They did announce support for game controllers for Xbox and PlayStation. So for a long time now, you've been able to connect a third-party game controller to the Apple TV, and these are game controllers that that work with Apple's MFI or made for iPhone specification, and really they look a lot like Xbox controllers in terms of the control layout. And this is great. I've been kind of on the calling for Apple to develop their own gaming controller. I'd still love to see this, but this was a really cool announcement that they're going to work with Xbox and PlayStation for game controllers. And so if you have one of those, you'll be able to pair it up with the Apple TV and use that as your game controller. And I'll be really interested to see if that helps spur development of additional games. I think Apple developing their own game controller would have done that even more. But this is definitely a step in the right direction for sure. I guess my only disappointment is that we didn't get support for Nintendo controllers, because Nintendo to me makes the best controllers, certainly my favorite controllers. Your mileage will vary, don't at me on that. But this is a good step in the right direction. They also announced a feature that is huge for me as a parent. I have 4 kids, and so everybody kind of has their own preferences for shows that they want to watch. And I kind of like to have my own stuff and not get it clogged up with the stuff that the kids watch, because that throws off recommendations and it clutters up my queue of things that I want to watch. So Apple announced that when the next version of tvOS comes out this fall, tvOS 13, that it will support multiple user mode. And this is where I should drop in like a cheering sound effect, because I'm very excited about this. Netflix has this, for example, where you can have separate user accounts where you can have your own queue and your own preferences and your own recommendations in there. Love that Apple's doing this with the Apple TV app coming out later this year. So that's really it for tvOS. And then Apple Watch. And I've got some notes here because, gosh, there was so much mentioned today that I don't want to skip over anything super important. New watch faces. Again, that's always going to kind of be a thing that they come out with. Some new watch bands. Activity trends. This is pretty neat because one of my favorite things about Apple Watch is activity tracking. And the older I get, the more interested I am in that for making sure I stay healthy and heart health and all that stuff. So now it's going to have some activity trends that look at your activity over time, because right now the activity, you can manually look at it over time, but it doesn't really graph it out for you in terms of activity trends. You can see graphs of heart rate and various other stats, but now with the new version of watchOS, you're going to be able to actually see trends over time, where it's going to be able to say, hey, your exercise is, you're improving the amount of exercise you're doing, great job, or hey, your exercise has declined, and it'll kind of give you some coaching, some kind of in-app coaching stuff, which I think is really good. They've also got some hearing health support built in, so it will actually use the microphone in the Apple Watch to detect the decibels. So if you're at a concert or a sporting event or something like that, and it's getting too loud, it'll warn you that you're, you might be in a situation where you're going to impact your hearing. That's really cool. I think, something that we don't think about enough is what impact are we having on our hearing. And so this is definitely a great thing that they're adding in there. And they're going to make it a lot. It's really interesting. When the Apple Watch first came out, they really made a big deal out of third-party apps, and kind of nothing happened with it, and they kind of moved away from making a big deal out of third-party apps for the Apple Watch, and now they're kind of bringing that back into the forefront, because now you'll be able to have the App Store right on the Apple Watch. No need to go to the iPhone app to do that. That's definitely going to make it a lot easier to explore, and it's kind of like when the early iPhones felt very tethered to iTunes. When you first turned on an iPhone, you got that connect to iTunes screen, and you had to plug it in to do anything. And over time, they cut the tether so that the iPhone is its own thing, and you could buy an iPhone and open it and use it without ever having to connect it to a Mac. I haven't connected mine to a Mac in a long time. And so it's great to see that the Apple Watch is becoming more its own product in that way as well. And it'll be interesting to see if, again, this spurs developers to kind of look back at the Apple Watch as a potential development platform for them to create apps for users. So that was kind of cool to see. iOS 13, of course, we talked about this. We've done a couple videos on this, but now iOS 13, when it comes out this fall, will have a dark mode. And again, this would be a good spot to drop in an applause line sound effect, because a lot of people have been waiting for dark mode for iOS for a long time. And we got dark mode for Mac in Mojave last year at WWDC, and now we're getting it for iOS. So this fall, when iOS 13 comes out, you'll be able to continue using the traditional light mode for iOS, or you can enable dark mode. I'll probably stick with light mode myself, but I know a lot of you guys have been looking forward to having dark mode, and your wishes and hopes have been answered, because now dark mode is coming to iOS. They also spent some time talking about Apple Maps, and of course Apple Maps got off to a rocky start when Apple first launched it in 2012, and it's gotten a lot better since then. But first impressions are first impressions, and they can be lasting impressions, and so Apple has had to continue to remind people that Apple Maps is there, and it's been getting better and better. I use it personally, I love it, but it's great to see that they are continuing to focus on it, and they really highlighted how they have put hundreds of cars and airplanes out there with LiDAR and all kind of fancy stuff to just continue making the maps better and better, which is really cool. And you can actually add favorite locations, which I immediately thought about this because I went to California a few years ago, and while I was out there, I took a tour of filming locations for the Back to the Future movies, because those are some of my favorite movies, and I kind of added them as favorites in Apple Maps, and now I can go back in iOS 13 and actually make a collection of those and put them in there. I also kind of keep, I don't know, because I'm sentimental, I keep track of previous places my family has stayed on vacation, and so I can make a collection out of that. But you can make a collection out of your favorite places to eat when you go on vacation. Just all kind of interesting things like that. And they also showed a neat thing with kind of a street level view. And again, Apple's playing catch up with Google. There's no question that Google has been the market leader in digital maps for several years now. And so Apple kind of showed off what is kind of a street view kind of thing, which they called look around. But they kind of demoed how, just like in Google Maps, you can kind of tap to have it zoom forward and kind of go down the street a little bit. But this view does it really fluidly and seamlessly, and it looked really cool in the demo that they showed. There was a lot of stuff around privacy, which is great. I mean, Apple has really put its flag in the ground and said, we are a company that stands on privacy. Apple today even said something they've said a couple times before, where they said they view privacy as a fundamental human right. And again, I don't think you should trust any company, but I certainly appreciate that Apple's making a big stance, a big thing about privacy. And that way, if you ever come across a situation where Apple has betrayed user trust and privacy on that, well, then you can call them on it, because they've made a big thing out of it. And I certainly appreciate that. given that a lot of other companies are looking to monetize you through tracking and things like that. So they showed off a feature called, oh gosh, what did they call it? Sign in with Apple. And the situation where this might come up is you're in an app and an app says, hey, sign in for an account in this, and you can use your Facebook account or your Google account. And that is certainly convenient because you already maybe know the password for this account. But when you do that, you are potentially giving this other service or app access to things from your Facebook account, personal identifying information that these other companies can use to better target you and data mine you and things like that. And so Apple created this new sign in with Apple feature. And they're actually enforcing this. They have some new guidelines that say if you're going to put a third-party sign-in tool, you have to put Apple Sign In. And again, this will not have any of that tracking information. And they even made it so that you can actually have it generate an email address just to send to the company whose app you're signing up through. So if you don't want that company to have your actual email address, it will generate I say a fake one because it's not your real email address, but it is a real email address that will forward to your actual email address. So I love stuff like that, and I'm certainly going to use the heck out of that when that comes out. They also talked about secure video for HomeKit. So if you have a home security system, home router, they're building Apple's security into those kind of things so that, again, identifiable information about you doesn't get sent to the cloud through some of these services that, maybe they make a great camera or a great router, but they're actually, some of your personal data is getting sent to the cloud either wittingly or unwittingly by these services. So that is absolutely fantastic. And they have kind of expanded Memoji, and Memoji is, Animoji is where you could kind of have these animated things that use the Face ID and the camera face tracking stuff built into the iPhone 10 and subsequent iPhone models. The iPad Pro now has it as well, so that you can have like an animal face that matches your facial movements. And they introduced Memoji, which is that, but it lets you kind of create your own avatar, kind of like the Mii's in the Nintendo Wii, where you can kind of design a character that looks just like you that works with this. And so they have expanded the ways that you can accessorize, makeup features, hair color, hairstyles, hats, AirPods. You can give your Memoji AirPods now. And they're even making it where they'll automatically generate a sticker pack for the Messages app based on your Memoji that you create, and even add it to the emoji picker, so you can send people, emoji like, the face and things like that, but generated out of your Memoji that you create, which I thought was pretty cool and fun. Is that going to change the world? No, but it's fun, and we all need some whimsy in our life, so I thought that was pretty cool. They have some changes to photo editing and organization. Always great to see more time sent to that. One thing that was really cool is they showed, I will say Siri didn't get as much attention in the keynote as I would like it to have gotten. Maybe there will be some subsequent things in the sessions that people have throughout the week here at WWDC. But one of the cool things they showed off on stage is that Siri's going to have a more human-like voice. And they had a real good example where Siri was just dictating through like a science textbook paragraph, and they kind of let you have a comparison between iOS 12 and iOS 13. And iOS 12, it sounds very robotic because it's actually chopping up various word sounds from that actors recorded and putting them together. And with iOS 13, Siri is going to sound a lot more human, and I guess that's potentially scary, but that is actually really cool. Really neat AirPods update. So one of the ways that I use AirPods and Siri together is in the car, because I want to keep my hands on the wheel as much as possible. But let's say my wife sends me a text message when I'm driving, and it's going to pop up on my watch. So if I tilt my watch, I can see it really quick, and I don't have to take my eyes off the road much. But the goal is to not take your eyes off the road ever. And Apple has a neat new thing with the AirPods and Siri, where Siri will automatically read to you the last text message that came in. So they had an example of a guy working out on like an exercise bike or something like that, and he got a text message, and it said, hey, you got a text message from so-and-so, and it says this, and he was able to just respond immediately with his AirPods, and that was really cool. Now, I still have the first generation AirPods. I don't have the new always on hands-free Siri, so I'm a little concerned that you're probably going to have the second generation AirPods for that feature to work, but we'll kind of have to wait and see. But that is a great feature, great for the exercise situation that they showed there, but I think also great for like in the car usage. as well, which was really cool. And so that's iOS, and of course there's lots of other stuff in there that you can read about on the website, and lots of other things that didn't make the website or the keynote, little things that they've put in there. But this is going to take me over to iPadOS, and this is one of my favorite parts of the keynote, because I love my iPad, I love my iPad Pro, and it's really cool to see the iPad get a lot of attention. And if I was going to say what a couple of themes were from this WWDC, it would be that the iPad is getting a little bit more Mac-like, and some of the great features of iOS are coming over to the Mac, and we'll talk more about that in a second. But the iPad operating system, the iPad version of iOS, has kind of become its own thing, because you have more multitasking features, more gestures, just things that are more computer-like that you can do on an iPad than what you can do on a phone, just because of the nature of the type of device it is. And so it's gotten specific enough that Apple has decided to actually call the version of iOS for iPad iPadOS, in kind of recognition of the fact that it is kind of its own special thing. And so that was really cool. And they showed off some new features, like the fact that you'll be able to bring in widgets instead of having to swipe over to see widgets. You'll actually be able to bring those on where they always show up on the home screen, which was really cool. They showed, they actually used the phrase multiple window support. So, on a Mac, of course, you've had multiple window support since the mid-'80s, where you can have, you say, Microsoft Word and open multiple windows and multiple documents within the same app, and you're going to be able to do that on an iPad as well, which is really cool. They showed off some new features for having the little sidebar where you can kind of pull, you can swipe up from the dock and bring something like Twitter up to the side, or Notes, or something like that, and they've made it a lot easier in this new iPadOS for switching between the things that you have in the little sidebar. So that was very cool. They didn't talk about this in the keynote, but one thing we talked about in a previous video was that the iPad was going to be getting mouse support as an accessibility feature. So this is really made for people with a mobility limitation, so that maybe they can't really reach up and use the screen the way most people can, but maybe they can use a mouse. And so you can actually connect a USB mouse, and there's a setting in the accessibility settings that allows you to go through and enable mouse support, and that is there, which is really cool. I'm definitely going to try that out and see what the experience of using a mouse is like on an iPad. But that was very, very cool. Oh, and you can do app expose. So one of the things that you can do on a Mac is you can do a feature called Expose, which will show you all your open windows, and you can do that on the iPad by swiping up and kind of holding the window there. But a Mac also lets you do single app expose, where you can, let's say you have 5 Word documents open, it can let you just see all the Word documents open, and you can do that in iPadOS as well. They also showed off new markup tools that are coming, especially if you're using an Apple Pencil, some really cool things there. They have some, and this is another thing that made me kind of jump for joy, is they are making it better to work with websites, because right now on an iPad, the iPad kind of falls into this valley between mobile optimized websites, which are more appropriate for an iPhone sized device, or full desktop websites that don't really work totally on an iPad. And so they said that in Safari and iPadOS, you will actually be able to, it'll actually automatically format websites in a way that is much more fitting for the iPad. And that is super nice. And then they went and talked about the Files app, where now it will support USB memory cards. That got a big applause. I was certainly happy about that. And also it will support SMB file shares. So if you're in a Microsoft networking environment, you can connect to an SMB file share right from your iPad. So just more and more things that make the iPad a valid option instead of using a traditional computer like a Mac or a PC. They're definitely making it more and more of a traditional PC-like experience using an iPad than what has ever been before, and that is very cool to see. Okay, so let me talk about the Mac Pro and the Apple Pro display for just a second. So I'm not going to get into the full thing. We've talked about the history of the Mac Pro and all that in the past. Today, Apple finally announced a new Mac Pro, and they went back to a form factor that is much more similar to the form factor that the Mac Pro had back when we called it the cheese grater, and when people kind of affectionately called it the cheese grater, or mockingly, whatever, because the front of it was perforated with holes for the airflow to come in and cool these components in the inside of the tower. And it kind of looks like a cheese grater on the front. And but really what that old Mac Pro model was it was a modular computer where you could open it up easily put in hard drives, RAM, PCI cards, different things like that, to customize the experience of the hardware of using the computer. And then in 2013, Apple introduced the Mac Pro that again kind of affectionately or definitely more mockingly got called the trash can, because it was a cylinder design that kind of looked a little bit like a wastebasket. And it was problematic for a few reasons. Apple designed themselves into a thermal corner where they were just not able to dissipate the heat properly from the powerful components that they could have put in there. And they also didn't update it for several years. And so they have gone back to what now looks even more like a cheese grater, if that's possible, but is back to a very similar design. It looks like what an evolution of that original tower design would have been, where you can open it up, you can put PCI Express cards in there, customize graphics cards, customize the amount of RAM you can, it's user serviceable RAM, all sorts of things like that. And so they have definitely brought it back into the type of design that people were looking to see who would be potential customers of a computer like that, where you can trade graphics cards out over time and customize it and keep building it so that it becomes a very powerful and very serviceable computer for a long time to come. And in that sense, Apple has delivered exactly what I think everybody who cared about that product has been looking for several years now. Now the price tag is definitely higher than what you may have hoped for, but this is kind of Apple's halo car. Apple has definitely built a high-end tower and high-end display that is kind of like when Ford designs a supercar like the Ford GT. This is not for every single person to buy. This is for those who need the most performance, have the money to pay for it, and it's really this is like the company saying, this is what we can do. This is the envelopes we can push. And that's what Apple has definitely done with the Mac Pro. Alongside of that, they announced a new Apple Pro display, and they really compared it to, they're not comparing it to a Dell monitor that you buy at Best Buy. They're comparing it to high-end studio reference monitors that people are using for to get the best accurate color and contrast lighting representation for mixing a movie in Hollywood, for example. And so they compared it to those reference monitors that cost like $43,000. And I jokingly turned to a colleague and said, it's going to seem cheap when they say this thing costs $10,000. It actually costs $5,000. And that is without either a mounting bracket or a stand. Those are sold separately. And the monitor stand itself costs $1,000. Now that was an interesting thing, and I don't know, I'd have to go back and listen to catch exactly what the sound was in the audience. It was kind of a groan or a laugh or a mix of all that, because that's a ridiculous sounding number. And, I'm sure it's a wonderful stand. I'm going to have to see some more details about it before I can say that it makes a lot of sense to spend $1,000 on a display stand for the display itself. But as crazy as that price is, I think, keep in mind that you can buy the display and a $200 VESA mounting bracket and hook it up to a wall mount or a third-party stand. You definitely don't have to buy the Apple stand to go with this display. And if you're already spending $5,000 on a super high-end monitor, you're buying this because you need a super high-end reference type monitor for doing high-end, probably video editing in particular. If you're mixing a Hollywood movie or doing high-end video editing work of that sort of thing, that's who that display's for. It's not for most of us out there. Probably not even for high-end photographers, although it would look fantastic for that, or graphic designers. This is really for the highest of high-end display customers. It's a 6K monitor with an HDR that is even beyond the HDR spec that I think Apple called Extreme Dynamic Range. XDR is what they're calling it. So, again, if you put it in the context that Apple put it in, of comparing it to reference monitors that cost tens of thousands of dollars, that contextualizes it properly. If you just looked at an announcement that said, "Hey, Apple came out with a Mac Pro that costs $6,000 and a display that costs $5,000," you're not putting it in the right context. Most likely, if you're watching this video, that computer and that monitor are not for you. They're not for me. They're for a very select customer who's really needing to push the envelope at the highest end of the hardware performance envelope and has the means to spend the money on it. And again, I think another thing to keep in mind with the price on these things, it's kind of like when Apple comes out with a $1,000 iPhone XS and everybody just looks at that number and says, wow, look at Apple coming out with this super outrageous for the super rich phone. And then you don't pay attention to the fact that Apple actually has a range of iPhone products across several price points, going all the way down to like $399. So, kind of the same thing is going on here. This is for a very, very specific pro customer, and if that is who you are, then you're probably very excited about this and have the means to spend on this. But they also still have a range of great products on down the line, including the iMac Pro, which starts at $5,000, $4,999. The iMac 5K, which is a lot less expensive. MacBook Pros, again, they have a whole range of computers that can still do some amazing things. It just all comes down to what is the right computer for the type of work that you're doing. So if you think this is too much money, it's probably not for you, basically. Okay, and then there's macOS Catalina. So I didn't get my wish. I wanted macOS Hollywood. Instead, we got macOS Catalina. And as we predicted, this is the death of iTunes. And what we mean by that is that now, instead of having kind of one app in iTunes that it's kind of like that big fat Swiss Army knife that does a whole bunch of things and none of them super precisely, now Apple's breaking it up into an app for Apple Music, an app for Apple Podcast, and an app for Apple TV. And so splitting those three things up will probably create a more satisfying experience because, again, you can go to the app for the specific thing you want to do and not have to, wade through an app that has too much going on, which I think was one of the big criticisms of iTunes over the last several years. And they introduced a feature called Sidecar, where you could actually use an iPad Pro to actually extend the Mac desktop. So kind of like using an iPad as an external monitor, but which had been kind of a rumor for a little while. But the part that I thought was super cool is that you can actually use your iPad as kind of like a Wacom tablet, paired up with an app like Adobe Photoshop on your Mac. And I thought that was super cool because that makes an iPad a super attractive thing to bring into a design environment where you get the benefits of like a Wacom tablet, but also the benefits that an iPad brings by itself. So that was super cool. Some great new voice control features, and they showed a really kind of inspiring video of a man in a wheelchair with severe movement disabilities, and he was able to do some amazing voice control work using these new voice control features. So again, I love Apple's push for greater accessibility in macOS and in all of its devices and products and software products, and that was really cool to see. We did get the merger of the Find My iPhone and Find My Friends app into an app that they're just calling Find My, which is cool. And then Project Catalyst. So Project Catalyst was the other big thing we were expecting from the Mac this year, and it is something that a lot of the people in the developer community have been calling Marzipan for the last year because somebody had kind of dug through under the hood of some of the Apple developer releases and found this term Marzipan for it. But officially, Apple is calling it Project Catalyst. And Project Catalyst allows developers to essentially check a single box in Xcode, their development tool, and take an iPad app and make it where it works on a Mac. And there's more to it to really make it feel at home on a Mac and feel like a Mac app. But in essence, that's what you have to do. You just check a box and it brings your iPad app over to the Mac. And so this is going to just throw wide open the doors for developers who don't have a background writing Mac apps, who maybe never would have thought of making a Mac app or never would have gone under that endeavor to learn the separate tool skill sets that you have to do it. Now they can just bring their iPad apps right on over into macOS, and that is super exciting. So this video has definitely gotten kind of long. If you watched all the way to the end, you are my hero. Be sure to like and subscribe and hit the little bell so that you get notified when a new video is up. This has been your Apple Update. It's been an exciting day. I'm your host, John Sherrod, and again, I'm going to have more videos this week where we kind of get into more details or talk about any new information as it arises. Thanks so much for watching. Have a great day.